liturgy coming from probably Athens or Thessaloniki, and they let the radio be the priest, the voice on the radio.
Yeah.
And they ate the bread and drank the wine.
Mm.
Again, I think if Christ wasn't present there, he's present nowhere.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. So there's a couple other questions I have. One is, you've also mentioned crossing paths with Henri Nouwen.
Yes.
And I'm more familiar with Henri Nouwen than I am with Dorothy Day, and you knew both of them. But I sense this common thread between them and between many people that live this life of deep spirituality, deep connectivity to humanity, this thread of loneliness. And I wonder about your experience with these two and your experience in your own life. Do you think that loneliness is a part of a deeply spiritual life? And how can we turn that into prayer, or what's your experience with that?
Well, in my case, I have experienced, everybody has experienced lots of loneliness, but at the moment, this particular period of my life has been amazingly free of loneliness. It's because I'm married to a person with whom I couldn't be in a deeper communion, you know.
Shout out to Nancy.
Hello, Nancy.
Yeah.
But it has been a long process getting to that place.
Mm-hmm.
And even in marriage, it's often a very long process getting to that place. Because, I mean, I brought a lot of fear into the relationship. I failed in marriage. And I felt kind of doomed. I was something, you know, I was never going to get married, and not really married, you know, capital M. You'd be in relationships. This is a little bit different. And so currently, all I can tell you is loneliness is not the immediate problem, but it has been at many times in my life. And I think for Dorothy Day, for example, it's remarkable the choice that she made for the title of her autobiography, one of the most important books I've ever read, The Long Loneliness.
Yeah.
And she wasn't kidding. She didn't mean she stopped being lonely at a certain point because she became Catholic, because she was part of the Catholic work, or because she lived in communion, you know, community. No, she was still lonely. You know? And I think Henri Nouwen, we know from his writings and from anybody who spent any time with him, he was a very lonely guy.
Yeah.
Reaching out all the time for communion and connection, but oftentimes feeling abandoned, you know. He was an ultra-sensitive human being, you know. And if he didn't hear from you when he was expecting to, or you hadn't written in a while, he could suddenly feel abandoned, you know. And I think a lot of people have this. I don't think there's such a thing as a person who is insensitive. I don't think there is any human being that is insensitive. And it might have been more extreme in Henry's case than most, but not a lot more.
Yeah, yeah. And when did you cross paths with him? That was at Yale, you said?
He was teaching at Yale, and I had just gotten out of prison. I was part of a community, an anti-war activity that brought me to prison for a little more than a year. I was part of a community called Emmaus House in East Harlem, New York City, Manhattan. And Henry he was teaching a course on Thomas Merton at Yale. And he knew somehow that I had known Merton. And he was able to contact me at Emmaus House and say, would I please come up to New Haven and speak to his students about what Merton was like as a person, because we're reading the books. But, you know, nobody here has well, Henry had briefly met him, but I mean, just hello, you know.
Yeah.
You know, no real exchange of thoughts. So I said, sure, of course I come up. And we discovered that we had the makings of a friendship pretty instantly. And I would come back at least once a year for either to talk about Merton or do something with Henry. And when he came to Holland, which was his native country, where I was living since 1988, he would, you know, come up and visit. Or on one occasion brought me down to his father's house. His mother had died by that time, and I stayed in his family home, you know. And we spent a lot of time together. When I was going through the failure of my previous marriage, Henry was one of the people who did the most to help me. I was devastatingly lonely and felt overwhelmed by failure. And I wasn't suicidal, but I wouldn't have objected to a bus, running me down if I could do it without taking blame for the bus. I was just really, I think the kids and my work and the obligations of Christianity kept me going. But Henry would call up about once a week and just chat. Just how's it going? What's happening? What are you doing? Who are you seeing? And at Easter time, that first Easter, he arranged with his travel agent. He said, I've contacted my travel agent. You will be receiving a call, and just let us know what flight you want. I want you to come and spend some time with me.
Wow. So, another thing I'd like to discuss, if you don't mind, is your relationship with Thich Nhat Hanh and the ways in which your relationship influenced one another. And I think, like we were talking about earlier, seeing one another and having conversations with one another along with our differences is so important. And you've had an incredible friendship with him.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, it was a very funny beginning. I was working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation as I've had 2 different jobs at different times with the FOR. At that time, I was director of Vietnam program.
Okay.
And Thich Nhat Hanh had come over from Vietnam as a guest of Cornell University and then of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And we were responsible for helping him to meet with people in senior government positions, newspaper editors, publishers, journalists, members of Congress, senators, so that they could hear a living voice from Vietnam talking about what the war was doing to ordinary people, the peasants. This is a war in which no one knows exactly how many people were killed, but the estimate is around 3 million. And this is in the relatively early days of that slaughter. And our hope was that Nhat Hanh, with his very pure, non-political voice, could touch people that might be impervious to more, quote, political, end quote, voices, which I think, in fact, was, to some extent, a fact that he did make a difference. One evening, I was asked at the last minute to accompany him on one of his events. I had previously, I'd been in the same room with him, I'd listened to him, I'd heard him answer questions, maybe even some of my questions, but I had no intimate contact with him. But I had recently, at a university in the Middle West, been invited to try LSD, a hallucinogenic drug. Now, I'm not a druggie, drugs are not my thing.
I can't wait to hear where this story is going.
And I decided, well, LSD does open up certain, quote, gates of perception, end quote. It certainly does. And if you experience nothing else, you find out a lot about what's going on behind the curtain in your unconscious, how your mind works. And people had described it as a kind of shortcut to enlightenment. Well, I doubted that was true, but I wanted to ask him. And I thought, I'm never going to have a chance to ask a Zen master again in my life. I'll never probably have an intimate contact with a Zen master. So here's a chance to find out somebody who knows about enlightenment, whether there's any connection between what I experienced and enlightenment, capital E. And so I decided, and I said, well, he'll be very irritated. He said, how dare you ask such a question? But I thought, well, there's nothing to lose. Maybe he will be able to give me an answer. And in any event, I will be annoyed with myself if I don't raise this. He was fascinated. We left the meeting we were at early. He didn't care for it very much, neither did I. We went down to a little Chinese restaurant around the corner, sat drinking tea, and I told him about this, and he just listened with absolute amazement and attention. Because he had never met anybody in the peace movement so far who was interested in enlightenment. He was quite surprised. And it turned out that there was very little connection between what I experienced and enlightenment. But that was what it really did was open the doors of a relationship. And then after that day, he asked the organization I was working for if I would normally be the person to accompany him on his travels. So we traveled all over the place together. And later, when he was settled in France, I was frequently with him in France and for longer and shorter periods. Living with him both in Paris and at first a community called the Sweet Potatoes, tiny. I mean, a community is hardly maybe 5-6 people, and then a larger community which has become well known. The what is it called? Something to do with plums. Plum Village. Plum Village. So we've spent hundreds of hours in conversation.
Yeah. It's wonderful. I would like to mention your website, which is jimandnancyforrest.com. Okay. Because there's some great posts on there.
Yeah, and speaking of Nhat Hanh, for example, if you were to go to the Jim's Essay tab on that site, and you'd find loads and loads of things that I've written or interviews and so forth. But there are several things having to do with Nhat Hanh, including an entry called Learning from Thich Nhat Hanh. And Nancy and I have just keep adding stories as they come to mind about experiences with Thai.
Before I met you, Jim, I had come across your website and was reading the piece, I believe it's called The Cup in Your Hands. Is that right?
Oh, right. That's one of the Thich Nhat Hanh's pieces,
About washing the dishes to wash the dishes.
Yeah. I was living at that time in Paris in the community near the Parc du Sceau in the southeast of Paris. And we took turns washing the dishes, of course. And one evening it was my turn to wash the dishes. At that time, I would say I would never regard it as a great honor to wash the dishes under any circumstances. Although I did it, of course, many, many, many times. From the beginning in high school, working in cafes and things like that. But never a great honor. You just did it because it had to be done, and maybe it's how you were making your money. So I was in the kitchen washing what seemed to me infinite number of dirty dishes in a very small, steamy space. Listening as best I could to the very interesting conversation that was going on in the living room, where there were a couple of guests who had come to ask Nhat Hanh questions, which I found very interesting. And he was answering, but his voice is very soft and gentle, and you got the occasional word or phrase, but not really hard to put it together in a meaningful way. And I was in a state of considerable irritation, as if smoke were coming out of my body, dark smoke. And Nhat Hanh appeared at a certain point at the door of the kitchen and said, "Jim, why are you washing the dishes?" And I thought, I did my best to think of what would be an appropriate Zen answer. And the best I could come up with, which wasn't much, was washing the dishes to make them clean. Well, which is true, of course, I was. But that didn't go very deep. And then he said, "Jim, you should wash the dishes to wash the dishes." And that was a real Zen answer from a Zen master, but it meant nothing to me. I was not about to be mollified by that. To wash the dishes, to wash the dishes. Okay, Zen Buddhism, And he could see that had not untied the knot. And then he said, "Jim, I want you to wash each dish as if it were the baby Jesus." That was good advice. And as a Christian, that was a challenge.
Right.
Nhat Hanh never tried to get me out of Christianity, not at all. And in this case, he revealed how much he understood and appreciated in Christianity.
Right.
And the challenge of seeing life in a sacramental way. That everything is an opportunity. And dirty dishes are as much an opportunity to pray as being on your knees in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Maybe better.
One of the things you had said about monasticism is you said monastic formation, both Buddhist and Christian, has much to do with discovering the significance of insignificant moments in the most routine activities. And I think that story sums that up so well. And just also the relationship in that story is so deep. The brotherhood that you shared with him, for him to respond like that is just, it's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very lucky. I've had good teachers. I have very little formal education and a great deal of mentorship.
Yeah.
Dorothy Day University, I recommend it.
So just a couple more questions, hopefully easy ones. I'm curious if someone were saying, I'm new to Jim Forrest, what book should I read? What would you say?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it would depend on who asked the question, really.
Yeah.
Do I have a favorite book? I like my children's books very much, and I wish I had a copy of one of them with me. There's children's books about St. Francis, not about St. Francis, that's in my mind to do, about St. George and the Dragon, and there's one about St. Nicholas. There's one about Mother Maria Skotsova, a Parisian Orthodox nun who died in a concentration camp after having saved maybe thousands, we don't know how many, lots and lots of Jews during the German occupation. And there are adult books. One of them, as you mentioned, was Praying with Icons. I think that's a good... Icons can be a school of seeing, and it's not just primitive Christian art that becomes interesting insofar as it brings upon the Botticellis and the Michelangelos. And the biographies of Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Daniel Berrigan, I think each of them is full of incredible stories and lots of direct quotations from these people. So they're a good way of meeting three of the most interesting people of the 20th century. The Ladder of the Beatitudes is a kind of crash course in basic Christianity.
You're reminding me of the excerpt you sent me from Praying with the Icons. Kind of about that reflects silence.
Yeah. I mean, there's a chapter on the qualities of icons, one of which is silence. I think we're used to a more narrative, illustrative kind of painting that tells stories, and the telling is the verb. We can there are paintings you can stand in front of and you can hear the painting, not just see it. Whereas with icons, you don't get that. You get this very two-dimensional world, very silent world. And it's, I think in terms of your own book on silence, you describe very exactly with wonderful distinctions the different kinds of silence there are. There's deadly silence, there's homicidal silence, there's
toxic silence,
icy silence, toxic silence. But there is also warm silence. There is the silence of a loaf of bread baking in the oven. It's a special silence.
Wow, that's a beautiful thought. I like that.
And there's the silence of the incarnate Word. St. John the Evangelist had a disciple named St. Ignatius, who was the first bishop of Antioch and who was martyred. And on the way from Antioch to Rome, where he was fed to the lions, he wrote a series of letters which come down to us as early testaments of what the early church was like. And he has this remarkable sentence in one of those letters: he who possesses in truth the word of Jesus can hear even its silence. And that's a very dear sentence to me. He who possesses in truth the word of Jesus can hear even its silence. And I think without silence we don't hear anything.
Yeah. Wow, without silence we don't hear anything. Yeah. Wow, okay. Well, I mean, we could go on forever, and I hope we do.
Yes, well, let's work it forever.
But yeah, let's work it forever.
Come in and visit us and
I'd love to.
Interview Nancy.
Yes. Last question we try to ask everybody: do you have a silence hero?
Silence hero. Silence hero.
Someone that's, really taught you what it means or the depths of silence for you. Or mine's Thomas Merton. So
I sort of immediately thought of Thomas Merton, but then it's ironic. Merton lived a silent life. He was in a community in which silence was the language of community.
Mm-hmm.
Silence is spoken here, as was said one of the signs.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he's famous for what he wrote. His words were written. You could say the words came out of silence, and in that sense, yes, of course, Merton is one of the leading spokesmen of silence. Spokesman of silence being a paradoxical term, but you can't be a spokesperson of silence. Nhat Hanh, of course, lives a very deeply silent life. Well, now especially because he's lost the ability to speak. He had a major stroke, barely survived.
That's right.
Every word he speaks is a word of deep silence. And the community receives that silence. I think dead people are very important in my life. They are living presences, but they are silent presences. But without them, I'd be with a very poor person. I think of the priest of our parish in Amsterdam, Father Sergei Ovsyannikov, is now in this deep silence. He died at Christmas time. But for me, he was a hero.
And your friend Dan Berrigan died about 2 years ago?
2 years ago, just it was on a few days, it'll be the second anniversary.
Okay.
Yeah. And when I last saw Dan, he was lying in bed, and I thought I was the first one to find his dead body because he was so still and so silent. I could hardly detect the beating of blood in his vein as I looked just to see, is he alive? And of course, the last part of his life was largely one of silence. He would point. The day I was with him, he was still speaking, but not long afterward, the speaking stopped. But he continued to be there. I mean, as Dan Berrigan, minus words, he was still very much himself.
Yeah. Yeah, silence. We hope to do an episode soon on silence and death, and the silence of death, and what that is, what that looks like, and the grief that's held within that too. But Jim Forrest, absolutely wonderful to have you join us today. And like I said, we could easily go on forever, but I trust that we've covered enough to at least give our audience a taste of who you are, apart from these names that I'm sure many have heard of. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for being a friend.
Thank you for your film, although I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward to it. But I have been reading your book, and it means a lot to me. And it's a blessing to be among your friends.
Thank you. Ta-da! Yay! Did I forget anything?